Hey everybody, and welcome back to our last installment for medical geography, people and the environment. As usual, pause as you need to pause to take in the information that's on the screen. So, a couple things I want you to be thinking about as we work towards wrapping up. We want to think about the connection between people and the environment and its relationship to diseases and the way that different systems interact. I also want you to be thinking about the role of consumption. So how are we consuming resources that are available to us? What kind of access do we have to those resources? Do we live in a core country, a semi-peripheral country, or a peripheral country? What is the relationship between those particular countries on an economic scale? And then the role of technology. As our quality of life improves, hopefully our life and health quality are on the same scale, but sometimes they're not, depending on access to resources, consumption, periphery, core, etc. And we also want to think about not just human increasing quality of life, getting better, but is that also correlating positively with our environmental quality of life for our plants and animals, and what kind of costs there are associated with an improved quality of life across the spectrum. Now, systems we want to remember are connected at both the temporal scale through time as well as the spatial scale. And we want to consider what impact that has for rates of change. Because if you're looking at it at the global scale, you're going to have a different rate of change versus looking at something at a more local scale. So those are factors that we need to consider as well. Now, within social systems, we've got a whole list of examples here. We are thinking about government policy across a broad spectrum of areas. We can think about demographics, geopolitics relative to one place being stable or not stable, like civil wars, for example, and mass migrations of people, as we have seen in the recent times. Technology, globalization, democracy, religion, all of those are going to impact what we see happening. And one of the big ones is demography. So what kind of population growth do we have? We know that water is not evenly distributed across the surface of the earth. The same is true of population. Where is population expanding? Where is population shrinking? What are the reasons for those? And how are governments dealing with population growth and the resources needed to improve quality of life, as well as improve health, as well as maintaining a good physical environment that underpins social and economic viability. We also want to think about the environmental systems along with those social systems. So we oftentimes look at this from the perspective of ecosystems, right? And if we say we have three basic ecosystems, we have got the water or the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and then we can think about the territorial sphere or land, if you want to think about it that way. So we have those big systems. So let's look at some maps and diagrams and infographics. So here we've got one associated with water. So we have a title from an article at the top: ocean acidification is threatening food security and will also threaten the food supply chain because there will be environmental changes relative to when crops are ready to harvest versus when they're ready to plant versus where you can grow them versus where you can't grow them with climate change. But if we're looking at it particularly from the perspective of water, as we are on this screen, we know that coral reefs and oceans are what we refer to as carbon sinks, that they hold carbon in. But that also means that we are changing the pH, we're changing the acidification in the water, which means that we're changing that ecosystem, which means that we have these teleconnections with our social systems as well. We can also think about water stress. Water stress can be associated with the type of climate region that we're in. So if we're in deserts, we're probably going to have a little bit higher water stress. But water stress for people is worse when we have large populations and limited amounts of water, whether it's surface water or groundwater. That's why we see India on this list, as we know that it's one of the largest population concentrations in the world. So do they have enough water for the people who are there? This is going to be subject to change as well, depending on all kinds of social systems and not just the environmental system. I also want you to pay attention to the role that climate change has. And even though we haven't done a climate change unit yet, we will touch on it at some degree or another, depending on whether you're in human geography or conservation. But we have an impact on air quality. So the infographic that's here tells us what kind of impact we're going to have on health with reduced air quality due to increasing number of wildfires, the types of pollution that occur, and greenhouse gas emissions, whether or not those are suppressed or decreased. We can think about how many allergens are in the air. A whole host of things are going to change with our air quality, which means our health changes as well. We can come at it from the extreme weather perspective as well, and what kind of impact that's going to have. If we have more intense fires, that means our air quality has changed. It also means that our water quality can change, and it also means that our soil quality can change. We can have more waterborne outbreaks because of extreme flooding or extreme storms, damage to infrastructure, water contamination. Rising temperatures, if we look at this one, means that our core body temperatures can go up. And instead of having hypothermia like we have in the wintertime, if we get too cold, we can have hyperthermia when our body gets too hot and we can't cool it down enough. And then we think about who is more susceptible to that. So we can talk about heat stroke and death and what that might have relative to diseases, not just for people, but also for our animal spheres as well. And then we can think about the diseases. So we can talk about the vector-borne